And joining us now in studio, Naheed Nenshi, the Mayor of Calgary, and we welcome you here, I should say, home. You're from here, right?
Well, I was born in Toronto, but we can't get away with letting people in Calgary think I'm from Toronto.
I understand, but you were born here.
I was born here. I was born in St. Mike's Hospital, and we moved to Calgary when I was about 1, and I came back to Toronto when I graduated from university and lived several years in my 20s here, living the life of a 20-something in Toronto.
So obviously your success is completely devoted to the time that you started in this province.
And clearly I took the success away from the hockey team.
Oh man, you're taking the shots already, are you? Okay, it's going to be that kind of thing. How many interviews did you do the day after you won your election?
Well, so for folks who don't follow politics, it's kind of an interesting story. Typically what happens is when you're a front runner, and how I knew I was a front runner is because you have a series of pre-booked interviews for the day after the election. And there's a series, you'll always do a CBC morning show, you'll always do certain lunch show and so on. So you kind of pre-book these. So the day before the election, or the day of the election, I knew that the next day I would have 7 or 8 media interviews booked, which is a pretty big day. And if I lost the election, then I have a free day. Pick up the signs. What I ended up doing that day is probably about 34 interviews over the course of the day, including, half-hour long form, 2-minute call-in with local media certainly, but also a ton of national and international media.
It was a big deal the day you won. That was big news.
Well, I think a lot of people sort of woke up and went, whoa, that does not look like Calgary. And that became an interesting story. And the interesting thing for me was that whole thing, the color of my skin, my faith, was never part of the election. The issue of the racial background never came up. The issue of faith came up, once or twice and was quenched quite quickly. And so I knew that going into the election, if I won, this would become a big story. And, I did have a choice. One can say no, even to Steve Paikin, if one wants to, if you don't think that that's a particularly interesting story. But in the cold light of day, after the election, I said, this is a remarkable opportunity to tell a story. It's very relevant to what we're talking about on the program today, but to tell a story about pluralism, about Canada, about Calgary. That's a story that is not told often enough. And in the world as it is today, with even the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom recently saying that multiculturalism in his country has been a failure, I think that's a story that's worth telling.
There was a great deal of sort of post-game analysis the day after Election Day on how a guy like you, never mind, all of the demographic factors, but the fact is you were running up against two, pretty well-heeled experienced politicians who I think most people thought were going to win. You were the third place guy most people expected.
I always say everyone was surprised except the voters.
Except the voters.
They knew what was going on.
Well, how did you win? Do you have a better sense of that today than you did back in October?
Yeah, I do. Right after the election, there was so much talk about this, right? How did Nenshi win? And I always joke that very few people ask me. And I do have an opinion on the matter.
Go ahead.
So there you go, an exclusive on the agenda. There were 3 things that were happening. Number 1 was that Calgary was ready for a serious conversation about the future. As much as people in other parts of Canada like to think of Alberta and Calgary sort of a one-party state where there is not a lot of discussion, there's actually a very vibrant culture of discussion, debate, conversation about the community, about the future. And there had been a lot of organizations that were doing things that were just in getting Calgarians to talk. There are TED conferences. I spoke at a TEDx conference in Calgary where you had to apply to go because they had to watch because they had so much demand. We do these things called Pachakacha nights where people will go and listen to 15 or 20 speakers on a common theme, 20 PowerPoint slides for 20 seconds each, and they'll sell out 450, 500 seat theaters regularly. So Calgarians were really ready. That was number 1. Number 2 is I like to think the candidate had something to do with it. Most people seem to forget that part. But really what it was the style of campaigning that we did. We really said that Calgarians are ready to engage as full problem solvers in the issues they face. We called it politics in full sentences, releasing extremely detailed policy, not shying away from controversial things by saying these are the trade-offs we have to make. And I think people really responded to that well.
You broke all the rules.
Yeah, and well, I think what we did is we applied rules that have always been there, but people have been scared of.
Well, politics today, if I understand it, and I think it was part of the story of the mayor's race in this city, You relentlessly hammer away on a single, simple message over and over and over and over, and that's how you win.
And
Did you do that?
No, we did something quite different. There was a simple message. There were priorities. Priorities around sustainability, priorities around building a city capital C, administration, bureaucracy, and council that was more responsive to citizens. So certainly there were themes. But we released a piece of policy every week. We called them Better Ideas. And at the end of the term, there were 13 better ideas. And one of my volunteers pointed out that any one of those 13 contained more words than the combined policy of platforms of my two rivals. Any one of the 13.
But more isn't always better. In fact,
because
less
you can
is better
snow
today.
people, right? But we really said, and it really plays to the third piece, which is my philosophy of campaigning was very similar to my philosophy of governing, which is go to people where they live and engage people. And so we did a lot of old-fashioned politics, shoe leather stuff.
But you did newfangled stuff too.
We did newfangled stuff
social
too.
Media in a big way.
We went to every festival, every pathway, every park to get out to people, to talk to them about their city.
Well, let me read
but then
this.
we also learned that people live online, and that's the piece that you were just mentioning.
Sure. Don Martin wrote this in the National Post just after your election victory. With the election victory by Naheed Nenshi, the white bread cowtown of the 1970s, where mayoralty bids were engineered over clinking Scotch tumblers in the Calgary Petroleum Club, has embraced ethnic diversity driven by Twitter-tweeting youth. A bachelor Muslim mayor for Calgary, a right-ranting redneck front-running in Toronto. As others have noted, the eastern and western capitals of commerce seem to have switched personalities in electoral preferences. You can't help but have noticed that too, right?
Well,
and what do you make of it?
Well, I think that it's a fun story. It's a beautiful narrative.
Is it not true?
And I used to be a pundit, so I would have written that if I had written the post analysis in the Calgary Herald. No, I was in Calgary in the 1970s. I grew up in that city. And in fact, I had been in Calgary longer than either of my two main rivals. So I think what that speaks to, and Don Martin is a good Calgarian. I mean, he knows the city, although he's been a national reporter for a long time, he knows that city well. But what it speaks to is a misunderstanding of what the community really is. Similarly to Mayor Ford here. Let's not forget that Mayor Ford got more votes than any other Canadian political candidate in history.
No. I know that was sorry, I should have
It's not true?
disagreed.
It's not true?
It's not true.
Tell me who?
Mel Lastman. Mel Lastman, who ran
because it was the first post-amalgamation election.
Correct.
See, I used to be a pundit, so I love this stuff.
Mayor Ford did very, very well, but I think his total is the third highest of all time. Lastman has the top two.
Isn't that interesting?
But I know why you think that, because that was actually, that was out there for a long time until I actually looked it up and tweeted it and corrected it. But anyway,
but the point
he got a lot of votes.
being that he got a lot of votes,
Yeah.
that voter turnout was, even a shade higher in the Toronto election, which was a week after ours, than it was in Calgary. So people were really getting engaged in a certain vision of the city. And I think that the reductionist stuff implicit in that comment is part of the problem. Because if you, for example, took Rob Ford's thoughts on red tape and bureaucracy and took my thoughts on red tape and bureaucracy and stripped the names out, you wouldn't know which was which.
Very similar, eh?
Very similar. And I think that that's the point that I like to believe that as a politic, as a body, the public has been able to say, we're more nuanced than politicians give us credit for.
Well, let's
and I
try
think
this.
that was important.
Let's try this. You've said Calgary now has a choice about the kind of city it wants to become. What is that choice?
Well, we are at a point where Calgary is transitioning from big, small city to small, big city, if I may. When you hit 1 million people, suddenly you're thinking life at a different scale.
And you're 1.2 million now.
1.2 million. And we have to decide if we want to continue the growth patterns that have served us so well for so long, because we don't have a lot of natural barriers to growth. And we have built a city around a certain suburban-focused lifestyle, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as we get bigger, we do have to make a decision on whether we want to continue that or whether we want to adapt that to, I'm going to sound like a planner for a minute, but to an urban form that's more efficient.
Well, you went further than that, if I may. You gave a speech to the Canadian Club in Toronto in which you said we've got to stop building communities that can't be linked to public transit. That's
Absolutely.
quite categorical. There are people who live in the suburbs of probably your town and this one who don't have any particular link to public transit who think they're doing just fine, thank you very much.
Well, you know, actually, we do have a link to public transit in every community in Calgary, but sometimes they're not very effective links. You know, people in Ontario are always surprised to hear that Calgary has amongst the highest percentage of commuters who work downtown who commute by public transit, that we have an LRT system that actually works extraordinarily well on linking people who live in the suburbs into the downtown
But why
core.
so categorical? That was,
But-
we can't keep creating communities that don't have a link to public transit. That's categorical.
Yeah, it's absolutely categorical, and it's true. Congestion robs quality of life, it robs money from the economy, and we have to be able to come up with thoughtful ways to manage it. Calgary is a city of people who drive, and that's largely driven by the urban form. And I'm the last guy to say don't drive. I have a car, right? I drive every day. But what we need to do is to be able to build a community where that second, third, fourth family car is actually a choice for the family. It's not something that they feel is an absolute necessity in order to live their lives and get the kids to hockey and whatever else. And in order to do that, we've got to provide choices. And for me, I've always been a strong proponent of effective, thoughtful transit. And it's the solution to so many things, not just congestion and air pollution, but even poverty and social inclusion, getting people from home to work. So I've always been a big proponent of that, and I'll continue to be so in this role.
As long as we're blasting stereotypes out of the water here, I think it's fair to say that a lot of Easterners tend to think of Calgary as, you know, the place that people from elsewhere in the country move to make a lot of money in a short period of time, probably in some oil-related business, 3 or 4 cars in the garage or something like that, and then they leave.
Don't forget the horns on the front of the Cadillac.
And the horns on the front of the Cadillac. How true is that image today?
It's not very true. We do, in fact, have many people from across Canada and around the world living in our city, and we welcome them. It's rare to find a born and raised Calgarian. In fact, my chief of staff is a born and raised Calgarian, which surprises people because his father is from Nigeria, his mother is from Africa, and his last name starts with an NK. And he's one of the few born and raised Calgarians I know. But that said, we welcome that. But one of our challenges as a city is to be both an economic driver of Canada, but also to be a magnet for people to come and stay. You know, as a volunteer, I was engaged with developing the 100-year vision for Calgary, something called Imagine Calgary. And it ends with a line that I didn't write, though I wish I did. I wrote the rest of it, but I purloined the line. And the line is, Calgary, a great place to make a living, a great place to make a life. And to me, that really sums up the challenge of developing my city as much as it does sum up the urban challenge across Canada.
There is, I think it's fair to say, a federal government in place today that doesn't necessarily share your view that the feds and the cities have to have a formal, I don't want to say constitutional, but let's say formalized relationship. You said in your speech earlier today, 80% of the people in this country live in cities, and that cities need to be given the resources, the tools, I don't know if you're talking about taxes or revenues or what, to deal with the issues that people want them to deal with. So how are you going to connect the dots here?
Well, you know, what I'm really calling for is what I've been calling a muscular urban agenda at the federal and at the provincial levels. That senior levels of government, even that nomenclature, senior levels of government, you know,
You hate
in
that,
itself, well, I hate it, but it's handy shorthand. But provincial and federal governments need to understand that it is the municipalities, it is the cities who every day provide the services every hour of every day that people use and need. I jokingly sometimes say if the federal government disappeared, it would probably take a week or two before anyone noticed. If the provincial government disappeared, if you weren't in the hospital or in school, it might take you a day or two before you noticed. If the city government disappeared, well, you'd have no roads. You'd have, in many places, no electricity. You'd have no water. You know, the sorts of things
Garbage
that we really
collection,
rely on.
hockey arenas, everything.
Yeah, maybe you know a little bit about that in Toronto, what happens when the city stops doing those things.
We do.
And hockey arenas, you know, the whole bit.
Was that another shot, incidentally?
No, not at all. I would be, any politician would be terrified at dealing with those situations, as your former mayor had to do here. But in any case, you know, that's the point, is that we need to be able to continue to provide those services, and we have very limited tools to do that with. You know, property taxes, user fees, and transfers from other levels of government. That's pretty much it. Now, I don't want to presume that our provincial and federal governments have been ignoring this problem. That's far from the truth. our provincial government in Alberta has been a very, very viable and active partner in helping us fund infrastructure. And the federal government, through the economic stimulus program, through the Build in Canada Fund, and so on, have actually been very active at the table. But it is fair to say that when this government took power in 2006, in that election, we did have one party that was really talking about an urban agenda and the party that took power not talking about it at all.
Well, let's hit it on the head. Paul Martin, and through his minister, John Godfrey, talked about a new deal for cities, and this current federal government, you know, in its wisdom, believes that national government's too big and it doesn't need to have its fingers in every pie. They don't believe in that.
Yeah, and you know, and frankly, I'm not a big fan of constitutional change to make this happen, but I am a fan of fully participating because we're all the same people. The people who live in Calgary are Albertans. They are Canadians. You know, the government needs to do what's right for them regardless. And we need this level of partnership. So what I'm really interested in is to all the political parties. We'll likely have a federal election sometime soon. And I'm really interested in hearing from all of the parties, what's your urban agenda? What do you think we need to do in terms of these municipalities where I said 80% of people in this country live?
Your Worship, it's awfully good of you to come into TVO tonight and share your views with us. Good luck on the rest of your tour here in your original town of Toronto. And we wish you well in your efforts in, we shouldn't call it Cowtown anymore, should we?
You can if you like. I still own some cowboy hats.
Calgary, Alberta.
Thank you very
Naheed
much.
Nenshi, thanks so much.
Thank you.